A chaotic scene erupted in New York City after anti-ICE protesters swarmed a hospital where federal agents were escorting a fugitive Saturday night, triggering clashes with police, arrests in the streets, and a political firestorm that quickly spread far beyond the hospital walls. What began as a confrontation over immigration enforcement rapidly transformed into a symbol of the larger battle consuming New York over sanctuary policies, federal authority, crime, public safety, and the future direction of the country itself. As protesters surrounded the hospital entrances, blocked emergency access points, and confronted officers outside, city leaders wasted no time turning the moment into a political statement against ICE. Critics argued that the situation had spiraled out of control because activists were more focused on protecting fugitives from federal agents than protecting the safety of ordinary residents trying to access emergency care. The chaos became another example of how immigration enforcement in New York has evolved into a full-scale ideological war.
Mayor Zoran Mamami immediately condemned ICE, rather than the mob that had stormed the area around the hospital, accusing the agency of operating recklessly and claiming its presence endangered the public. His remarks ignited outrage among supporters of stronger immigration enforcement, who argued that ICE officers were attempting to remove a dangerous fugitive, while protesters were the ones escalating violence in the streets and targeting police officers performing crowd control duties. At the same time, New York Governor Hochul attempted to draw a line against any expansion of federal immigration operations within the state, publicly responding to warnings from border officials about a possible surge of ICE activity in New York. She declared that the state was not requesting additional federal enforcement and insisted local authorities should focus solely on protecting their communities rather than cooperating with immigration crackdowns.
Federal officials responded by making it clear that cooperation or approval from state leaders was no longer part of the equation. They argued that sanctuary policies, forcing ICE out of local jails and detention systems, leave agents with no choice but to conduct operations directly in neighborhoods, on sidewalks, outside barbershops, and in crowded public spaces, where tensions escalate much faster and where the risks to both officers and civilians increase dramatically. Supporters of sanctuary cities insist these policies protect immigrant communities from fear and intimidation, but opponents argue the opposite has happened. They claim sanctuary laws effectively create safe havens, where criminals know local governments will resist cooperation with federal agencies, making certain cities more attractive destinations for fugitives seeking protection from deportation or federal prosecution. Critics also argue that New York's revolving door justice system compounds the problem. They point to repeat offenders being released back onto the streets after arrests, lighter sentencing standards, and growing resistance to jail time for many offenses. According to them, the combination of sanctuary protections and lenient criminal justice policies has produced an environment where dangerous individuals face fewer consequences, while ordinary residents deal with rising insecurity and higher living costs. At the heart of the debate lies a larger ideological conflict over what New York should represent. Opponents of current policies argue the city has become increasingly hostile toward capitalism, law enforcement, and border security, while simultaneously expanding expensive public programs that place greater financial burdens on working taxpayers. They believe the affordability crisis and public safety crisis are directly connected to political decisions made over many years. Housing policy has become another battlefield in the argument. Politicians promoting rent freezes are celebrated by activists who see them as protection for struggling tenants. Yet critics warn that freezing rents without addressing rising taxes, mortgages, insurance costs, and operating expenses will eventually drive landlords out of business, reduce housing development, and worsen shortages that already plague the city. Walking through New York today, empty lots and stalled construction sites have become symbols for many residents of a city struggling under its own policies. Supporters of reform argue these problems are not accidental or unavoidable, but self-inflicted consequences of regulations, political ideologies, and governance models that discourage investment while simultaneously increasing costs across nearly every aspect of life. Meanwhile, outrage intensified after reports surfaced that the fugitive at the center of the hospital confrontation reportedly had a prior assault-related history and allegedly attempted to strike ICE agents with a vehicle. Critics of the protesters questioned why activists would mobilize to defend someone accused of violent behavior rather than support efforts to remove potentially dangerous individuals from the streets. Federal officials stressed that the incident at the hospital was not an aggressive raid targeting patients or medical facilities. According to their account, ICE agents had already completed processing and were preparing to leave when protesters arrived, surrounded the area, disrupted operations, and clashed with officers. They argued the true invasion of the hospital came not from law enforcement, but from the mob itself.
Another incident in the Bronx intensified tensions further, after a young man seen running from ICE agents sparked widespread outrage online. Witnesses described him as someone known in the community, who had grown up in the United States, leading critics to question why immigration authorities were involved at all. Yet federal officials argued that individuals who flee from law enforcement inevitably trigger investigations, regardless of immigration status. Supporters of ICE pointed out that agents operating in sanctuary cities often lack access to jail systems, where identities can be verified safely and quietly. Instead, because cooperation is restricted, officers are forced to conduct operations in public, where confusion spreads quickly, crowds gather rapidly, and misinformation travels even faster. In many cases, they argue, simply identifying oneself peacefully resolves the situation immediately.
The governor's proposed local cops, local crimes legislation escalated fears inside federal agencies. The bill would reportedly prohibit the use of city or state property for immigration enforcement, eliminate remaining partnerships between federal immigration officials and local authorities, and potentially expose federal agents to lawsuits for alleged constitutional violations committed during enforcement actions. Federal officials warned that such legislation would effectively force ICE out of controlled jail environments entirely and onto city streets full-time. Instead of retrieving wanted individuals from detention facilities, officers would have to deploy larger teams into neighborhoods, increasing the visibility of operations and creating exactly the type of confrontations critics claim to oppose.
To many conservatives, this appears intentional. They believe activists and progressive leaders want highly visible street confrontations because such images generate outrage, energize political movements, and create narratives portraying the federal government as oppressive. In their view, forcing ICE into public spaces is not an accident, but a deliberate political strategy. At the same time, supporters of sanctuary protections argue federal immigration operations themselves generate fear, division, and instability within immigrant communities. They insist aggressive enforcement tactics damage trust between residents and local law enforcement, while making families afraid to seek medical care, attend school events, or report crimes to police. Federal officials counter by arguing that many claims about ICE operations in schools, churches, and hospitals are exaggerated or false. They challenge critics to provide concrete examples where agents entered elementary schools or churches to conduct mass raids, insisting enforcement priorities remain focused primarily on fugitives and individuals considered public safety threats. Still, the optics of immigration enforcement remain politically explosive. Videos of handcuffed individuals, chaotic arrests, and emotional family reactions spread rapidly online, fueling anger and reinforcing existing political divisions. For opponents of ICE, every public arrest becomes evidence of government overreach. For supporters, every blocked enforcement action becomes proof that sanctuary policies are undermining national security. The broader national debate now centers on whether federal law can be selectively resisted depending on geography and local politics. Critics of sanctuary cities argue the United States cannot function with one set of immigration rules in some states and another set elsewhere. They warn that allowing certain regions to obstruct federal enforcement creates a dangerous precedent that weakens the integrity of national law itself. Supporters of stronger enforcement also argue sanctuary policies create unintended incentives for criminal organizations. If traffickers, gangs, or fugitives believe certain cities provide safer environments due to limited cooperation with federal organizations, they may strategically establish operations in those areas, turning sanctuary jurisdictions into logistical hubs for broader criminal networks. Border officials insist that increased ICE presence in New York is now inevitable if cooperation continues to collapse. Without access to detention facilities, transportation systems, or local jail partnerships, federal agencies say they must compensate by deploying more officers directly into communities to locate individuals manually, dramatically increasing operational visibility and public tensions. the political consequences of all this may shape upcoming elections. Progressive leaders believe public outrage over immigration enforcement can mobilize voters and build momentum against the federal government, while conservatives believe growing frustration over crime, affordability, border security, and disorder will push voters toward tougher policies and stronger enforcement measures. Observers across the country are now watching New York as a symbol of a much larger national struggle. To supporters of sanctuary policies, the city represents resistance against what they view as harsh federal overreach. To opponents, it represents a warning about what happens when ideology overrides enforcement, when federal law loses authority, and when public safety becomes secondary to political theater. Federal officials maintain they will continue enforcing immigration law regardless of local resistance, arguing that abandoning enforcement would effectively create entire regions where criminal fugitives can operate with reduced fear of apprehension. They insist no law enforcement agency can function properly if political pressure prevents it from carrying out its core responsibilities. As protests continue growing and tensions rise between activists, local politicians, federal agencies, and ordinary residents caught in the middle, New York finds itself standing at the center of one of the most explosive political and cultural battles in America. Whether the city becomes a model for resistance or a warning for the rest of the country may ultimately depend on how voters respond to the chaos now unfolding in its streets.